Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host, Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Sarah Hepola. She's a freelance writer, co-host of the Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em podcast with former guest Nancy Rommelman, and author of Blackout, Remembering the Things I Drank to Forget. Sarah, welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here.
It is good to finally have you. The book was interesting. I'm excited to talk about that. But I guess I want to start with the topic is obviously a very personal one, and you came out the other side. What made you decide to write about it? You could have just moved on with life without talking about it. Get it, you're a writer. But what made you think that this warranted an entire book?
I'd always wanted to write a book ever since I was a little kid. In fact, I mean, a lot of my drinking story, which where my creativity kind of became a little bit wrapped up in my drinking, was in many ways an attempt to kind of imitate the kind of old tales of swaggering drinking and you know the old novelists that used to live that way. And I always thought I would write a book while I was drinking. And what was funny was when I quit drinking, I was 35 years old, and I actually thought for the first 6 months I wasn't going to write at all because my creativity was so wound up in the drinking process. And when it started to come back, and it came back in a story that I had written for Salon, an online magazine where I was working at the time. It was just such a good feeling, and I wanted to follow it. But I also was looking around me at a lot of the books that were out there, and the story for the longest time about women's drinking was that it was this thing that you hid. It was something that you were ashamed of. But I had come up in a different generation where I really had been so proud of the way that I drank. I drank like a man. I bragged about it. And I thought that there was an opportunity to write a story about kind of like a new chapter in the women and drinking saga that people hadn't quite captured yet. And so that's where it started. I think I was also bound and determined to do something in sobriety that I hadn't done in my drinking years. So the idea that I could accomplish this, the one thing that I had tried so hard to do in my drinking life and never gotten around to, that I could do it after I quit drinking, was incredibly, like, that was something I wanted to chase after pretty hard.
Well, I'm gonna get to Will's for some of his comments, but one thing that you said right on, I was going to bring it up later, but you went right to it. So it's interesting. The view of alcoholism or just simply drinking based on gender is interesting, right? Like, there is a different perception. You're looked at differently. You even write about early on when you started drinking how you got away with it because, I don't know, because you're a girl. That's the reason why.
Well,
no one would suspect you of drinking.
Nobody suspected the little girl to be drinking. Yeah.
Right. So talk a little bit more about that, about how that manifests itself. What is the difference, either if it's just in how you're perceived while you're drinking, or when you're trying to get sober, how people look at what those gender differences are? Because those of us who don't drink to the point that, at least they don't realize that they have a drinking problem, probably don't think about the fact that if they thought about it, they noticed it, but they probably don't think about the fact that there are gender differences in how this is viewed, and how, you know, you probably the attitude you take when you're drinking.
For sure. Well, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and, you know, during those decades, you're really seeing the swell of an idea that women can do whatever men can. You know, I think back in the day, there was an idea that women who drank, you know, if you drank, it was, you know, it wasn't ladylike, and you had to, you know, conform to certain social norms. But by the 80s and 90s, you're starting to get this sense that there's like an added boost. There's like a swagger to the woman that drinks. You start to see a lot of marketing around women and drinking in the same way that you saw this around cigarettes. Virginia Slims, of course, had the famous campaign that was about like what's the you've come a long way,
You've come a
baby.
long way,
Come a
baby.
long way,
Yeah.
baby. Right.
Yeah. And they roped this idea of female independence in with smoking because smoking was traditionally like more of a masculine activity. Well, the same thing is happening with women and drinking. And so by the time I get to college in the 90s, I drank along with the guys, and I just remember how impressed all the guys were. Like, wow, like you can, like, whoa, you can really put him back. And you start to really get a bit of an identity around it. I mean, I think it was still transgressive to drink a lot, but at the same time, there was this almost kind of like sexy swagger around it. And this is something I talk about in the book. By the time we get to the turn of the century, of course, you're living in the Sex and the City era. There's Bridget Jones's Diary. You're starting to get a lot of female identity, like the idea that strength and independence is kind of signaled by your ability to hang with the guys, to drink like the guys. And I got a lot of juice out of that. I mean, look, I'm a 5'2" woman. I'm never going to step up to a guy on the sports court, but I could match them drink for drink in a bar. A lot of women that I've talked to over the years talk about that scene in Indiana Jones. Do you remember back when Miriam, I think, drinks a big guy under the table?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, it's one of these moments when a small girl does this thing that is, you would never associate with somebody her size, and how cool she is and how strong she is. And I think that idea was something that I chased and I shaped my identity around. But what I found was that as I got into my 30s, there was definitely this sense of like, oh, I think you've let the party go on too long. I mean, I started to feel, so I think there was a lot of accolades in my 20s when I was acting this way. And then I felt like the pendulum swung in my face a little bit in the 30s.
Right.
Where it was kind of like, girl, you need to get it together. And I didn't see that happening with my guy friends. I do think guys get to act the fool a little bit longer, and everyone just kind of puts up with it. Oh, like, oh, it's just that drunk guy.
Right.
And I used to really rail against this and feel like it was a double standard. Well, it kind of is a double standard, but I will tell you, I actually feel very grateful for it now, because I feel like I called bullshit on my own kind of bad behavior in a way that I saw a lot of my male friends who drank alongside me and with me kind of keep going in that life, because society didn't, blow the whistle on them and kind of excused it. And I've had friends that have drank themselves to death. I have friends that have terrible drinking problems. And they're, once you get into your 40s and 50s, and then you start to really feel the physical, like you're in heart attack land, you're in, like you start to get the breakdown of the body. And I feel really grateful that I quit at the age of 35. But there's no question that I also quit at the age of 35 because people were like, yeah, girl, that's not cute anymore.
Right. Will, I'd love to hear your points, but one thing she said that's interesting too, that makes me think about something you talk about. You kind of jokingly, it's like you want everything equal. And when I think about Craig Scott, when he was talking about Robin Banks, and he was like, and you kind of had a back and forth with him. And one of his points was, well, that's not fair. Yeah, you were like, but you were Robin Banks. Yeah, but that white guy did the same thing, so he shouldn't get less time than me. And you're like, yeah, give both of you a bunch of time. I mean,
Oh yeah, you're talking about that pro-black bank robber who, I mean, he had the data. He was like, yeah, black bank robbers get a year at least more than white bank robbers. And it was like, well, why did you stop robbing banks? And he didn't really have a comeback for that one, I don't think.
Right, but your interesting point is always like, well, I'm fine with just giving you both equal time by giving the one with lesser time more, not necessarily bring it down. So it kind of ties to our point of saying, well, they told the girl to stop, and that's a double standard. Well, it might be better if they just also tell the guy to stop too, not tell the woman not to stop.
Well, that's
Well,
the
yeah,
thing. It's like
double
I seem to be, fighting for the right to be a drunken buffoon into my
Right.
40s.
And to
Like, who
die
wants
young,
to
right.
like?
Yeah, I mean, double standards aren't inherently bad. Like, I was talking recently with like a really pro-black friend of mine, and they were like, because black men are perceived as strong athletes, we're less likely to be given addictive pain pills. And I was thinking about this, and I was like, isn't that a very good thing? Like, a lot of us are athletes, and that helped us duck the opiate epidemic, right, bro? Like, I live in Kentucky, and it was just very hard to get this through the shell. Like, but it's racist. Like, yeah, but like 100,000 of us are alive every year
Right,
because of this,
right.
because whites are seen as weaker. Like, I'm cool with that. So I mean, standards can have effects that are positive and negative across a range. Well,
Right.
so yeah,
But go ahead,
but I
tell me
mean,
your thoughts on
yeah.
the book of the or kind of her approach to the feminism aspect of or
Well,
how women are breaking the
I
code.
mean, this even beyond feminism, which we talked about the other day with Peachy Keenan, was pretty resonant to me because I think it's something you see. Like, I'm from Chicago, you are as well, actually. But I mean, this is something you see in any big city, like because marriage is so delayed, because
Yep,
so much
that's
work is
exactly right.
remote, like people stay in the scenes, for want of a better word, for a really long time. Like,
Mhm.
I'm just now getting to the 40 mark myself, and I have friends that are like a bit younger, like guys in the crew's little brothers, but that are like 34 and they're still ravers and hipsters and shit like this. And I mean, that are investment bankers by day.
Mhm.
And to a certain extent, this would have been viewed as existentially ridiculous. Like in our grandparents' generation, these guys are wearing like short shorts out to bars and all this kind of stuff, like picking up women, so I've dealt, I mean, being completely honest, I've dealt with some of these questions myself. Like, I recently decided to start at least drinking less. I mean, I need to lose about 50 pounds. Like, all this playing around that you do as a younger person, there's normally a natural cutoff to that, right? Like, your sergeant or your wife, the senior partner is like, okay, enough with the bullshit. Like, if you want to progress, if you want to make officer or partner, do anything here, if you want to stay married to me, you're gonna have to quit this. And
Right,
today, we just, especially perhaps for men, we don't really see those cutoffs. So,
right.
I mean, like, my youth scene was rave, actually. And I mean, I actually partied without discussing anything illegal on a pretty high view podcast till I was like 30. I mean, like, people would be like
Yeah.
rolling and waking up in my house that were, fairly notable people. And so I guess the question is, instead of me talking, what made you, for people that haven't read the book, make the decision to quit, to kind of almost get to normalcy? We talked to Bridget Fetisi recently about this, in
Oh
fact.
yeah.
But like, what made you make that decision? And then how'd you do it? Because like, I'm finding it difficult. So are all my boys. Like, it's quite a challenge. How'd you get through that?
Yeah. Well, before I say that, I just want to
I'll
say
just wait for me.
this is absolutely a story of a kind of culturally protracted adolescence.
Yeah.
At scale, that's one of the things that's happened. When you look at drinking rates, what you tend to see is that they all go off the cliff after people have kids. It's not so much marriage, it's after they have kids because they just can't keep up the lifestyle. But you've pushed marriage and childbearing so far. So you know one of the things that happened for me was that, like, and I didn't mind that. Like, I moved to New York at 30, and that's another like protracted adolescence, right? I mean, people there, it's very normal to see people that have kids in their or just having kids in their 50s or whatever. um but I was getting into these
Via
years
these
where my
crazy technologies, if it's anything like Chicago. Sorry to jump in there, but yeah, like, it's very rarely just like my husband and I decided to have one. Like, there are a lot of players involved, like the clinic and so on. But
oh
yeah, sorry.
right. Well, yeah, and by the way, my second book is about being single in my 40s and not having had a kid, but having wanted one, and dabbling into that world
Oh, you're gonna get
of
in trouble for saying in this culture saying you wanted a kid. That's probably worse than having one.
I know,
It's
I
probably worse
know.
than having one. All right, but
It's okay if you just sneak off and have one, but to verbally say that
To
you wanted one,
verbally
no, no,
say it.
no.
I know. I wanted a kid and I didn't have one,
Right.
I'm one of those, the time ran out on me. But also because I didn't want to, like, once you get into that world of assisted reproductive fertility, like, it's just really crazy. It's very
Mhm.
expensive and all that stuff. But
Right.
I was edging into my 30s, and it's almost like I was on this party bus that people were slowly getting off because they were getting married, they were having children. I was more and more alone on that and I was, um, you know, finding. I wanted I wanted a boyfriend. I wanted a family. I wanted stability, but I felt like my life was kind of continually on this rocky path. I just remember getting to be about 33, 34, 35, and just seeing very clearly like I was never going to get the life that I wanted if I stayed on this track. But like Will said, like there's a very big gap between wanting to change your drinking and then actually changing it.
Right.
Um, I probably like in some ways, like I was trying to manage my drinking from the time that I was, in my late 20s. I moved to New York thinking I was going to get a hold of my drinking, which is crazy because nobody ever gets a hold
In
of
New
their
York,
drinking in
right.
New York City. Like you're just going to go the opposite way. But you know, I tried all the different things. Like I read all the books. I tried all the juice fasts and did all that. I mean, and because I really wasn't comfortable with AA, it was it I would go, I would feel like very allergic to it. I would end up leaving. But in the end, for me, I ended up needing the accountability of some group, and AA really gave that to me.
Mhm.
I wonder what I would do now. I mean, it's been 13 years since I quit drinking, and there's all these different programs. There's online communities. You know, there's there's alternates to AA. But that's what I did. And I also had to, for at least a year, kind of retract in my life a little bit. Not go out. It was because I kept trying to do this thing where I was trying to hold on to both worlds at once.
Right.
You know, I was trying to continue to go to the bar and hang out with my friends, but just not drink. And I think that's just it. It was just engineered to fail.
Right.
Like I was always going to slip and then or like I can't tell you how many, like I was trying to date and I would go on dates and I would walk into the date being like, I'm just gonna have water. And I would sit down and just be like, bartender, like I would crumble in like 10 seconds
Right.
because I was just so
It's almost like
nervous.
muscle memory at that point, right? This is what I
And
do. I
I
sit
was
down and put my hand up and I get a double scotch.
I was like, there's just absolutely no way I'm gonna sit through like an hour of this date without drinking. There's just no way in hell. So yeah, so I probably spent about 2 years, in this kind of tortured back and forth of like, I'm gonna try to manage and quit. And I had to fail spectacularly in many times to realize that for me, I just couldn't start. Like as soon as I start drinking, I don't want to stop. I
Well,
have that
well,
compulsiveness.
can I ask you this question? Then I hope I'm taking a guess. Obviously, I don't know, but I hope it doesn't prove me wrong since we had an earlier conversation about my spidey sense and my common sense. But what role do you think, if any, the culture plays in someone who, whether they have an addictive personality? We'll get to addiction in a minute. But so you're a drinker, you have some addiction, you're trying to, you're on that roller coaster trying to get off. And you talked about how it's hard to go into the bar because that's what you're used to. But the culture between movies and all that kind of stuff, that's always been the case. That's not new. They're a little bit more, graphic and in your face in the last 20 years than they were in the 60s, but they've always been there. But in addition to that, it's the way we view these things, like social media and between friends. They're like, it's no big deal. So to say you have an addiction or to say that you're trying to quit, people look at you like, the culture is telling you it's okay. There's all the hip magazines are writing articles about why you should do more of this, why this is cool, why they're
Yeah.
wrong for judging you. So in the midst of you being in this fog, does that play a part that makes it more complicated, or does that have any effect?
Well, I quit in 2010 and it was definitely like a very drink heavy, like the culture was very drink heavy,
Right.
you know? And like I said, about women in drinking. Like every one of the shows I was watching, it would seem like some woman, in order to telegraph that she was cool and interesting, would pick up a glass of wine. It was Kerry Washington on Scandal. It
Right.
was Robin Wright Penn on House of Cards.
Right. Yeah.
It was that this was always what they would do. And just this idea that I would be uncool, I wouldn't be that cool, interesting woman if I didn't have this part of my personality, which is really silly when you think about it. I mean, it's just drinking, whether I do it or not. I'm just me. What does this have to do with my core value? But I definitely felt that way. It's also really hard for women, I think, in particular, when they stop drinking in the dating world, because guys are very much like not into it.
Wow, I didn't
Guys
even
are
think
like,
about that. Yeah.
oh yeah, they're guys are like, oh shit, you don't drink? Like, what are we gonna do?
How am I gonna take advantage of?
How am I gonna take advantage of you is the thing that they're kind of not saying. But it's
Well, yeah, I think the
and
stereotype is that men are too relaxed and too brutish, and women are in general not relaxed enough and too quote unquote prudish. If I had to like judge dating broadly, so like if as a man you walk into a first date and you order a double scotch, I would imagine any of my female friends would be like, I don't know. And it's the same thing if you're a woman and your opening line is like, no, just water for me. I mean, and you'd wonder if that would be followed by a bunch of questions about your, adherence to Christian religious doctrine or your opinions on pornography or something. Like you might have to scratch this one off. So, there are those stereotypes that people have, and they're based in a sort of reality.
But Will, isn't it the same thing for how sober people are treated in general? Like as you get older, you tend to care less.
That's a very interesting question.
Right. So as you get older, you care less. But if you're 30, 27 to 32 and you quit drinking, everybody wants to know what's wrong with you, right? It's like, oh, you go hang out at it doesn't even have to be a bar. I can get a bar because you expected to drink, but it can be a work gathering and then everybody's getting a drink. It's like, no, I'm just gonna have a cup soda or something. Oh, you're a recovering alcoholic?
Well, that
what
actually
do you tell me the story of why you don't drink.
Something that I sometimes say actually, which is that there are a lot of quote unquote privileges in life. Like, I mean, there's male, female, and rich, poor, and so on, as well as the racial stuff we always talk about. And a lot of them are shit like this, like pretty privilege. How smart are you? How aggressive are you? Especially I don't know about especially for men. For everyone, probably prey drive. But this is another one. Like, are you seen as a boring prude? Like in major city social life, yeah, that's probably a big negative. The thing with drinking, I mean, when Sarah said, I didn't know if I'd still be me, what I've always found when I used to party, especially with non-alcohol substances, is that you don't actually improve usually. I mean, there are drugs that can open like the gates of perception, so I've heard, and you can write some interesting stuff. But I mean, like, if you're on alcohol or any of the common versions of speed or something like that, you're either just yourself or 5% worse, but you feel a lot better. And so I think that's
right.
That's something people have to adjust to. Like, you don't feel like a confident God anymore. Everyone else, especially for my friends that used to do coke, is kind of like, thank God he's shutting up. Everyone else can now contribute to the conversation, but you feel worse. So that I think it's an important dichotomy. And
actually,
final line.
It's a great point. And it also takes me back to why I wanted to quit drinking, which is that, I lived in that dichotomy where I felt as though I was the life of the party, but increasingly the what I was getting back from friends of mine were like, you were like really loud, like you were really obnoxious, but it is what you have to break is your addiction to that feeling, is your reliance on that feeling.
Right.
And there's a reason why they call alcohol liquid confidence.
Right. Well, the last thing I want to say about drinking before we get into some of the particulars of the book, you just mentioned one with friends, which I found really interesting. But you made a point earlier when you were talking about the drink in the hand and the females, how they view. So it used to be, Carrie Bradshaw and Sex and the City, but theirs were martinis, right? And then you talked about Kerry Washington and wine. And when you said that, it made me think, that has even changed, right? So now, it's culturally, this is another cultural example. It went from girls as prudish to, hey, look, giving you confidence and giving you an attaboy because you can drink with the boys. But back then in the 80s and 90s, they were drinking martinis, they were drinking wine. So now it's like, if you watch shows now they have to either do drugs with the boys or they're drinking scotch, right? They have to prove
Yeah.
that, because
Oh, yeah.
it used to be feminine drinks, but now the cool chicks drinks. I know your drink of choice was beer. That was because of whatever, but you know that what you tasted, what you liked, and what you didn't like. That was still a choice of what you like. But now it's like the culture is saying, oh, the hip girls drink single malt scotch and everything else just like the guys. So even the drinks are changing in the culture from a gender standpoint. That's that
Yeah.
equality again, right?
They get more hardcore. Yeah. Like, and it's about trying to prove yourself in men's spaces. And yes, I drank beer, but I used to, I mean, I loved drinking scotch and whiskey until it just absolutely like obliterated my mind. Like I got the worst blackouts on those drinks. So
Right, right. And then you mentioned your friends. You write a lot about that in very detailed fashion. And in some ways, people sympathize with you with how you're feeling, like you said, what you felt versus reality. But then
yeah.
also your friends, because your friends are in that weird space that Will was talking about. So we're partiers too. We're all going, we're drinking. We all went to college. We were drinking and hanging out. And we joke at the beginning about what you did last night. But now we're 28 and we're like, oh God, what you did last night. So
Yeah.
talk about that and how some of them, there was really just ways that in different groups they decided to deal with it. Some of them confronted you and said, you need to do this. Some just fade into the background, right? And some just find different ways to deal with it. And but some tried to talk to you about it. So how you weren't receptive until you were, and you know what friends you still talk to and that kind of thing. What was the friend space of getting sober?
I think it's really hard to have a friend that drinks too much, and you know, everybody decides kind of a different approach to it. And I had a lot of friends during that time, and there were friends of mine that were just never going to turn me away. They were totally supportive, totally cool, never, you know, confronted me. But I had a couple friends that just got really beat down. A lot of it for me was the emotionality of how I got when I drank. You know, I would just be very, like, I would cry a lot. I
Mhm.
would, you know, I was very dramatic, and it just got very wearing. And so they would try, like, I remember there was definitely a progression of like, it would start out with, I'm worried about you. And that's hard because it's like, you know, my response is like, well, you don't need to. I'm fine, you know? And then it would go to like, okay, you're embarrassing me. And I remember when it hit, you're embarrassing me, that was the one that like totally punctured through,
Right.
because I was like, oh my God, I'm embarrassing. Like, not only am I embarrassing myself, I'm embarrassing my friends. And it was so different than, again, what I thought, you know, because to me, I'm still living this hero's tale of being
Mhm.
the life of the party. And, you know, I think what I did at first was to kind of pull away from those people out of my own embarrassment. I mean, if you tell me that I'm embarrassing you, it's like, okay, fine, I won't hang out with you anymore. And then my life is just getting smaller and smaller. Um, you know, I I think it was, and I think it was hard for my friends too, because none of them wanted to quit drinking. They
Right.
were still drinking,
Mhm.
you know, and they liked drinking with me when it was like in the first 1/3 of the night. It
Right.
was just the second 2/3 that
Mhm.
everything kind of fell apart. And so, you know, again, I had to kind of pull back from a lot of my friends in my life, and kind of get myself together for the first 6 or 9 months of my sobriety. But
Mhm.
again, at this time, my friends were starting to have their own children. They were starting families. They were starting full lives that I had kind of been left behind on because
Mhm.
of the own habits in my own life.
Gotcha. And earlier we were talking about what we learned about, because you do a podcast as well, and like what you learned. And just yesterday, like we was talking, I was like, hey, this one piece is interesting. I never knew about that because it's not the world I live in. So I got to give you credit. So I was talking. I like to talk about. So one of my friends came up and was like, yeah, you got this podcast. You know, who do you interview and all this kind of thing. And I talk about the people and the stories that are interesting. And I was talking about you. It's like, yeah, upcoming. I got this woman that's coming on. It's a really interesting book and story, whatever. And I was telling him what the book is about, and he's like, I used to get blackout drunk, right? And that's when he stopped or whatever. Because I was like, I Now, keep in mind, I'm not that like I didn't party like Will, but I'm not really a prude. I worked in restaurants and bars, so I had years where I drank every single day. I had to drink every day. So maybe I don't have an
Yeah.
addictive personality, whatever. But so I saw a lot of people drinking. I drank a lot, but I never and I got to the place where people would get drunk and pass out. I know passing out really well. But I never met anyone who would, or maybe I just didn't know, who would drink and would look to the outsider like they were still functioning, but have no idea what was going on. And so that's what happened to you and what you described. So talk a bit about, describe what you felt, what you did remember, or what it's like to black out, because I don't have any experience with that.
Yeah, it's a really strange but common neurological quirk and side effect of drinking that's very little understood.
Mm-hmm.
So basically in a blackout, you drink so much that part of your brain starts shutting down. It's the hippocampus. It's the part that takes short-term memory and puts it in long-term storage, and it gets disabled. So basically you can continue talking to everybody and having conversations, and you know have what's called procedural memory. I mean, you know who you are, you know where you it's just that you're not storing it. So
Right.
later you won't remember anything. So this is why people end up, if you ever get in those conversations with people where they repeat something they just said 5 minutes ago, and you're like, do you not remember when you said that 5 minutes ago? Those people are usually in a blackout. And what's weird about it is that not everybody has them. You know, only I say only, but it's about 50% of drinkers are genetically predisposed to having a blackout.
Right.
And just so people know, there's kind of two different kinds. There's the less severe kind, which are called fragmentary blackouts. Sometimes they're called brownouts, and it's kind of like a light flickering on and off in your memory. So you can kind of remember like patches are missing.
Right.
And then there's this thing called en bloc blackouts, which is a French word. It's ENBLOC. And it basically means just like huge swaths of time are missing. That's the more severe kind. Those are the kind that I had. So basically, you know, I would be operating for hours at a time, and not be able, and would not remember what had happened. I mean, when you talk to blackout drinkers, and it gets really grisly, you know, you'll hear stories of people losing days at a time. You'll hear stories of people waking up in cities that they don't know how they got there.
Waking up in hotel rooms on top of a man, having sex with them, and don't remember how you met him.
So, for instance, i.e., yeah, somebody might have opened their book with that.
A hell of an opening, I tell you.
Well, it was a hell of an opening for me. It was in my life. That was a hell of a moment.
Right.
Coming out of a blackout and being on top of a guy and not knowing who he was or where he came from was at that time the freakiest thing that had happened in my life. And I will tell you, at the time, I was like, well, first of all, I was like, I'm never telling anybody this happened. Then, of course, I use it to open my book. But since the book has come out, I've heard from a lot of different people that have had this experience.
Wow. Well, and then, of course, side note, you got in trouble for the way you described it because they felt that it was, I don't know, somehow hurting the feminism cause, because you were like, because tying it a little bit to the how people say, I think this was in the podcast when you were talking about date rape and believe all women and Kavanaugh, and you're like, well, it would be hard for me to come back later and say this guy raped me because I was on top, so I was in a position of control, and people got upset when you said that. Like, how would you say something like that, right?
Well, we were in the middle of adjudicating a lot of these sexual assault cases, and people wanted bright, clear lines. They wanted to say that if a woman had drank to a certain extent, you know, then that was, there wasn't consent.
Right.
And one of those bright, clear lines was blackout. But that's a problem because
That's
how can the
weird.
other person
How do
know
they know?
if you're having a blackout or not? Because
Right.
it's
Yeah, to jump
happening in
And you
your
say
head.
50% of people are
to
predisposed
to
to it. So can't some of the men be blacking out too?
yeah, to jump in quickly there, that's something that's one of those awkward things to talk about, but that's just obviously true. Like, I mean, I teach in college right now, and I've had some executive roles there as well as teaching, and like the majority of sex assault claims, like on campus, aren't guy is hiding behind bushes attacking women, not making light of that, but it's stuff exactly like this. Like man and woman both get very intoxicated and don't remember really what happened.
Yes.
And I mean, there are a whole bunch of questions like, is there a situation where you're just going to charge the guy with something?
Mhm.
Do you know, like, would you as a guy be expected to understand that your partner was really, really wasted if they seem perfectly normal? Which is one of the awkward realities of people blacking out. Like I've had one of my friends who I'm not going to name would actually use let's say other substances to counter like non-functionality drinking and would have
Yep.
these hours long lucid blackouts where he'd be talking to people about like the writings of Marcel Proust and so on. He's a well-known academic right now actually. And he the next day he wouldn't remember shit. We would be
Yep.
eating breakfast and it would be taken as a like a mitzvah to fill him in on what had happened. And later it was taken as a mitzvah to tell this guy to stop drinking, which he doesn't at the moment.
Right.
But I mean, like in that situation, what do you do? It's a legitimate question. And I mean, that's a huge amount of sex in hookup culture, where people who genuinely like each other but would normally have waited a date or two are wasted and have sex and both kind of like it or don't, and then move on. And that's something that both feminists and evangelical Christians, who I think have trouble conceptualizing that, really kind of do badly with. And just last comment, I guess there's no real shame to that when you describe your experience. It would shock a lot of people, but that's almost medical. Like if you're dealing with an addiction and that's one of the side effects of it for you, that's just going to happen. Like sometimes you're not going to remember things. So it's just hopefully if you get into intense enough experiences where that happens, that you stop doing the thing. There's not really a moral there.
Right.
Yeah, well, it was definitely like a wake-up call to me, right? I mean, to me, one of the sort of signals of needing help is the unmanageability of it. And if you can't remember what you did, there is a terrible unmanageability to
Yeah, for
it.
real.
But to the issue of sexual assault, particularly in the college campus areas, which is, my book came out in 2015. So this is pre-Me Too, but it's post a lot of kind of we've had years of discussions around Title IX. There's like consent classes that, and one of the things that happened in that conversation was that alcohol became a really taboo thing to talk about, which I thought was like a huge mistake. At least this was in feminist circles. Because for so long, what people had said was, oh, they were just drunk,
Mm-hmm.
too bad. Like if she was drinking, we can't, and it was excusing a lot of really bad behavior, but at the same time taking alcohol out of the conversation made it almost nonsensical because people were doing things that they would normally never otherwise do. And they were also, they were having sex, before they even knew each other, had much of a relationship to even talk things out. So then it was
Yeah.
getting adjudicated in these courts. I mean, it was really a mess. And as far as like what the line of consent should be, I don't even know. I don't know, but I think you have to have alcohol in that conversation.
You have to
And you have to know what the secondary signs of blackout are.
One comment as a guy might be that, I mean, the old stereotype of Greek houses, and I think this is true for white, African American, whatever, was that guys who were sober were attacking women who were really wasted. So, I mean, like that, I don't see no one has a problem with prosecuting or pursuing that. The issue, if you're talking to people who don't really dislike each other, but who think something might have happened and they're both talking about it honestly, is that that's almost never what you get. It's two people who thought the other person looked lucid and were rolling, quote unquote, or
Yep.
were very drunk. And that's it. And that in that situation, I don't personally, I have a legal background, actually. I don't really see any charges or anything like that you can bring. But the other solution of the three possibilities is just you charge only the guy. This seems to
Which
be the
is
perfect.
which is what
Right.
was happening for a while.
Yes, that's the
Although,
preferred feminist rule. Like only a man, like a penis. No, but it is like only a penis ever or whatever can be a rapist. Rape is a person with a penis misbehaving, the famous line. So like that's what a lot of campuses do, like including a couple in my state. Like, you know, Jack and Jill both have 5 drinks and hook up. Jack is convicted of rape. That's a poster. So I mean, that to me is nonsensical, but it's fairly common.
So one last thing I want to say to point out about the book is that there's a point at your as you're going to struggling with AA, as you say, like it wasn't really comfortable, and trying to be sober, and you talk about needing a spiritual life, and it was interesting in itself, but it made me think because, like Will said, we just recently talked to Peachy, and you had different backgrounds and ended up in the same place. So you come from a conservative Christian background, and you kind of got to the college age. It's like, that's not for me. Let me move away from that. She grew up in a secular atheist home, although her mom was against the feminist thing, but she felt she didn't have a foundation and she needed that and didn't know it. But at some point, you both realized there was something more than just me that we needed. So talk about why you even quoted the late David Foster Wallace saying that there's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice is what to worship. So talk a bit about how that was important for you.
Yeah, I mean, well, I grew up in Dallas and it was a pretty conservative Christian environment. So my family was kind of gently Presbyterian and also very much like, hey, whatever, suit yourself. But I was raised around this very intense religiosity that I found quite hypocritical. And then by the time I got to college, I mean, it was kind of like, oh, good, we can kind of worship at the altar of art and kegs, and I think I never addressed this part of myself that was always seeking something bigger than myself. For years, I would get really hungover, and that when I was really hungover, if I went into nature, I would just almost like cry, just at the release and the connection of something that felt bigger than me. And I didn't really understand it. But I was just hungering for something bigger. And I had I still, I have a really hard time with sort of like the Christian God. But I think what changed for me was knowing that I didn't want to close myself off to that. I wanted to be open to that. I find something bigger than myself in the night sky or in the ocean or, in just the energy between two people. And I pray not because, I mean, this is an old C.S. Lewis line, but it's like, not because it changes God, but because it changes me. I think I had a real kind of like unreflected intellectual allergy to religion and spirituality.
Right.
And I think being 35 and beat down, realizing that maybe this was a part of my life that needed soothing, needed something. But it's been the slowest part, the sort of slowest, most mysterious part of my sobriety. Because, I didn't have like some sort of born again conversion experience.
Right.
I just became to slowly open myself up to different kind of ways of seeing the world.
Right. And then one last thing, and I'll let Will close it up with anything you want to add, is the book. People should read the book. It's an interesting story, but you're a really good writer. And even though it's your memoir, I'm reading it as a novel. I'm sure you intended it that way. And so you pieced it together and you paint it so well. But at the end, you talk about, because you started drinking at an insanely young age. I don't even think I would feel comfortable saying the age. I won't do it.
Okay.
But yeah, really young people, really young. But anyway, so you tell the story about how you, at this point, you're like 13 or whatever, and your friend brought back this old tape of your childhood friend when you're in your 30s and sober, and you play this recording of you talking about an experience drinking and early sexual experience you had, which is basically statutory rape.
Yep.
But the interesting part about it, as you talk about it and write around, because I listened to the audio too, and you played.
Oh yeah.
But you tie that situation with Johnson, who we didn't get to. We talked about the opening of the book and in Paris, your situation in Paris Hotel, but there's a part two to that opening, and you tie those together. You go from there to the end and tie those together. So talk about the way you wrote the book and how you tie that early experience and how you think it affected you in your drinking going forward.
Well, I remember, first of all, I have this. I think most people don't have something like this, but I have an actual cassette tape of me at the age of 13 describing this experience to a friend of mine where I had just come back from a summer with my cousin, and I was 13 and my cousin was 18, and I was hanging out with all these older kids. And, I felt so cool to be drinking and hanging out with them. But when you play older kid games, there's a reason why 13-year-olds are really probably should not be hanging out with 18-year-olds. And I got over my head really fast. And but what strikes me in my telling of that at the age of 13 is you can hear this kind of affected tough girl persona that kind of like reaches out and is kind of like, oh, this was, it was cool, I did this, and I'm cussing a lot. It makes me cringe a million times to listen to it because it's a very put on kind of voice, but I know it was a defense on my part. But what I remember about both those times with both those men was this sense of preferencing how they felt over how I felt. It was like, oh my God, I hope I didn't upset them. Did I disappoint them? And I think this is very common for women, and we get ourselves into a lot of trouble and endure a lot of pain by sort of preferencing the comfort level of the person that you're with, as opposed to speaking up about your own level of comfort. And that was the through line that I saw in my drinking life, and to a larger extent in my life in general, was just, it wasn't about, am I comfortable with this? It's, are you okay? Are you having a good time? Am I pleasing you? And I had to do some work to kind of readjust the lens on that question.
Well, I gotta say, if it was, I guess you got to tip it to the one side because of the age, but I was torn on which one was worse, because Johnson really pissed me off. That situation, reading that part was pretty rough. I was like, but then I guess at 13, I guess that part is worse. But I can see why you tie those two together. Will, any final thoughts?
Just any final, well, I actually have a final question. I mean, and a lot of this, like I said, some of this kind of resonates with me, and I think it would with a lot of people I know. Like just the progress of the story. I mean, the idea that a lot of people get involved in kind of seeing life, quote unquote, because as a kid it seems really cool. I mean, I could see virtually any of my friends, male, probably more than female, doing the same, like, kind of badass routine about things like brawling or having sex at 14. They didn't know what they were doing. I didn't know what I was doing. But I mean, like, and that can also be, I'm sure, more traumatic for people on the female side. But I've heard some interesting later life reflections from a lot of them. I had some myself. But I mean, and then the progression on when you talk about this as a young adult, and there's not that natural cap anymore. Like the average age of marriage, I think Peachy told us 31 for women, 33 for guys now. So you don't stop until you're 34, 35 for a lot of people. Like, I think you're probably right around the curve there. So this sounds pretty familiar. I guess so the question I would end with is, what advice would you give to other adults who want to grow up? I mean, our average audience is probably like a 35-year-old professional. What advice would you give that woman or that guy?
I mean, yeah. It's like we have a society where we don't have to grow up anymore. And I think what I would tell them is that there is a great, it's a great gift to become responsible for your own life and to take responsibility for your actions. I feel like there was a lot of selfishness and self-seeking that went on for me in my early 30s that I feel like I've been able to leave behind. A lot of that. Also, the other thing I would say is isn't it like, I don't know. I got this. I remember hearing David Sedaris talk about quitting smoking at one point, and he was like, I just smoked all the cigarettes I could. Like, I smoked it and I was done. Like, I just felt that way with drinking. Like at some point you've got to move on and find other joys to fill your life. I drank, like I had my time, and there's joy and beauty in growing up, in being an adult. I think I came of age at a time when that was kind of like, you didn't want to grow up. You wanted to just stay cool and relevant forever. But there's a lot of beauty in letting go of that younger self, of shedding that.
All right. She is Sarah Hepola, freelance writer, co-host of the Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em podcast, and author of Blackout, Remembering the Things I Drank to Forget. Sarah, it's been great. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
From you commies who lame, no, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.